Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to be with you all this afternoon and to be chairing this first session of the First Practitioners e-conference themed Equipping the Church, Bills, Law and Leadership. I'm Michelle Mori. I am a full-time administrator here at SATS. I'm also a UNISA LLB graduate and an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa, and I'm currently pursuing my Bachelor of Theology with SATS. This first session is themed The Church and South African Law. And the purpose of this session is to outline the possible legal challenges churches in South Africa have to be prepared for and advise church leaders how to navigate the South African legal landscape. The first portion of this session will be conducted as an interview and will last about 30 minutes. At the end of that 30-minute portion, I will open up the floor for questions to our speaker from the audience for about 15 minutes or so until the end of our time, which will be at about 5 to 3. So that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Advocate Nadine Badenhorst.
Hello, Michelle.
Hello. I just want to give your credentials to our audience. Nadine is a founder member of Freedom of Religion South Africa, also known as FORSA, and she is an advocate of the High Court of South Africa. In this capacity, she serves as the full-time legal counsel of FORSA and has represented religious freedom rights in multiple court cases, including before the Constitutional Court. Nadine is also a popular speaker and has spoken on religious freedom issues on various international and local platforms. And having obtained a BA LLB degree from Stellenbosch University, Nadine was awarded a scholarship to study an LLM degree in international human rights law at the University of Essex, United Kingdom, in which she obtained cum laude. During her study, she also held an internship at the United Nations Secretariat in New York. And so without further ado, hi, Nadine. Hi again.
Hello, Michelle. Wonderful to speak to all of you this afternoon.
Yes, we're so grateful that you could join us today. So, firstly, what is the mission of FORSA and why is it important?
Okay. So FORSA obviously stands for Freedom of Religion South Africa, and we are not a law firm, but a legal advocacy organization that works to protect and promote the constitutional right to religious freedom in South Africa. Now, already that's a mouthful, so let me break it down. What is the right to religious freedom? It's a right that everybody of whatever faith has in South Africa. In fact, every human being, simply because they're a human being, they have the right to religious freedom. And our Constitutional Court, which of course is the highest court in the country, has already on various occasions explained to us what this right entails. And they have said that the right to religious freedom includes the right not only to believe in our hearts, whatever we want to believe or not believe, and in the case of us as Christians, it means the whole Bible, including the parts that people do not like, do not agree with, find offensive. So that's the first component, to believe in your heart. But secondly, also the right to freely say what you believe and to share your belief with friends, with colleagues, in-person conversation, but also to share it on social media or in any other space. And then thirdly, the last component is the right to freely also live out our beliefs. And again, not only to live it out in the privacy of our homes or in the safety of our churches, but out there in our workplaces, in the marketplaces, in the schools, on campuses. And as you will know, Michelle, we live in a world that is increasingly becoming more politically correct. And it is particularly these last two components, the right to freely say what we believe and the right to freely live out our beliefs, that are increasingly coming under fire. Increasingly, the message around the world in progressive Western democracies, but also in South Africa, is believe in your heart, whatever you want to believe, no problem with that. But for heaven's sake, we don't want to hear your fundamentalist, narrow-minded, bigoted beliefs, and we definitely don't want to see them being lived out. And so what we are finding is that increasingly people of faith and Christians in particular are being forced either by government policies or laws that come before parliament or through court cases often instituted by activists to either keep quiet about their religious beliefs, which are seen as, politically incorrect, or to compromise on the living out thereof. And so FORSA, coming back to your question, FORSA exists to make sure that this does not happen and that our religious rights, in particular to freely share our beliefs and to freely live out our beliefs without fear of punishment or persecution by the state, remain respected and protected in government policy, in laws that are being passed by parliament, and then also actually wherever religious freedom is threatened. And why do we do this? Well, we do this ultimately to make sure that the doors for the gospel in South Africa remain open as wide as possible for as long as possible, to make sure that the good news of Jesus Christ can be shared and lived out without, as I said, that fear of, no, we need to hide away or we need to be very careful how we do it. And I would submit that this is a very important mission, because without the legal freedom to live out and to share our faith, in other words, to be ambassadors and witnesses for Christ, actually the role of pastors, of churches, of ministries, even the role of training academies such as SATS, it will become very difficult for them to fulfill their core mandate or to fulfill it in present form, and may even face legal penalties simply for sharing, living out, and training others to be faithful followers and ministers of the word.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's, from what you've said, it is clearly a very important mission. So my next question is then, in terms of private Christian organizations like SATS and various Christian churches who hold to what can be described as orthodox Christian beliefs, are they in danger of being at odds with the law? How should such organizations go about balancing their responsibility to the state, the Constitution, with their responsibility to God as prescribed in Scripture?
Very important question, Michelle. So I would say most definitely private organizations such as SATS, but also churches, Christian ministries are in danger because, as I already explained, increasingly we are finding government policies, laws that are adopted that are politically correct and therefore often at odds with the more conservative or traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs. And this is not only happening in South Africa, it's happening worldwide. And so increasingly pastors, Christian churches, ministries, businesses, faith-based schools, professional people, including, I'm thinking doctors, psychologists, social workers, teachers, university lecturers, students, parents, even anyone really who's a Christian. We're finding that they have a target on their back, and increasingly those are examples of people we've assisted because they're being taken to court simply for sharing or living out their deeply held beliefs, which are regarded either as hate speech or unfair discrimination. And really no one is exempt. If you are a Christian in South Africa today or in the Western world, you have a target on your back. And that would most definitely include Christian organizations like SATS or Christian churches who hold to Orthodox Christian beliefs. Now, let me make it very practical and give you a few examples of cases that I personally or FORSA have been involved with in the last 7 years since the organization started in 2014. One of the earliest cases, even before FORSA started, was the case of Krihari Training Center. And what happened in that case is Krihari Training Center is a Christian academy that trains people up to be ministers of the gospel. And they had an elective subject on human sexuality, and a component of that subject dealt with obviously homosexuality. They believe that according to the Bible, that people aren't born gay and that Jesus can set people free from that lifestyle. And Krihari a complaint was made against Krihari Christian Training Center by the then Deputy Minister of Justice. And he lodged a complaint against him with the Human Rights Commission, who investigated the matter and found that even though what Krihari was teaching was biblical, it was nonetheless unacceptable. And they basically said that Krihari had to change what they were teaching students. So that was in the early years. After that came the NG Church versus NG Church Moraletta Park case, where they employed a a LGBT teacher, really to instruct this in worship and your worship ministry. And they were taken to court because of their traditional beliefs around the issue of human sexuality as well, and ultimately were ordered to pay a fine. My church, and that's actually how I started my church, was taken to the South African Human Rights Commission, not because we believe crazy stuff that other Christians don't believe, but particularly also on the issue of parental discipline, and because we actually believe the scriptures, that speak about parents disciplining their children, obviously in love. We're not talking abuse, and but the mere teaching of those scriptures were regarded by the Human Rights Commission as now you propagating and promoting abuse against children. And so we were taken to the Human Rights Commission, and the Human Rights Commission said we may no longer preach those scriptures in any way that seemed to indicate that it may imply, physical chastisement of children, obviously moderately, reasonably done in love. And to do so is to advocate violence against children. They said we must remove those scriptures from any teaching material. Our parents had, our pastors had to go for, what did they call it? Sensitization training. That's what they recommended. And then subsequently, there was also a case opened up against my church again, because we believe that people aren't born gay. Jesus can set people free. Subsequently, various other churches and Christian ministries have been taken to court. There was the case of the Methodist Church, where Ecclesia de Lange, she's an LGBT minister who wanted to get married in the Methodist Church. They said you can still be a member of the church, but as a leader of the church, you need to hold to the values that we hold to. And that's not what we believe on. We believe that marriage, according to the Bible, is a man and a woman. And she took them all the way to the Constitutional Court, and she lost the case. But Michelle, what is very important in that case is that she actually lost on for a technical reason. And the Constitutional Court in that case already said that if a similar case properly presented before the courts were to come before the courts again, that they would be prepared to scrutinize the doctrines of the church to see whether it actually measures up against the Constitution. And that, of course, just opened the door wide open also for the case that came against the Dutch Reformed Church. And, there have been several other cases against African Enterprise, Pastor Chris van Wyk. Most recently, right now, I'm involved in a case where we're a friend of the court in a case that's come against a Christian independent school. So a number of cases, as I say, the number of cases are increasing. Typically, these cases come in the form of either hate speech or unfair discrimination cases in terms of the PUDA and the Equality Act. Typically, what happens is when people are found guilty, they're ordered to make an apology together with an undertaking that they won't say that thing again, or they won't do that again, where the compromise comes in, and often also a monetary award that needs to then be paid to an LGBT organization or, some kind of other organization. So yes, it is definitely a challenge for Christian churches, ministries, training academies who hold to Orthodox Christian beliefs. The Concord has on various occasions already said that the state should avoid putting people before that painful choice of choosing between obeying their faith or the law. And yet that is exactly what we see happening increasingly. And obviously, as Christian pastors and ministries, we want to obey the law because the Bible tells us respect government and submit to government. But on the other hand, we also want to obey our faith, which for us is actually a higher law. And increasingly, it is becoming just impossible or more difficult to do both at the same time. So where does that leave us? Well, ultimately, if no other choice, then civil disobedience, so that we can be obedient to God's law. But I would say very strongly, not before we've exhausted all the other avenues, engagement with government, with Parliament. There are opportunities and channels for us to make submissions to Parliament, to challenge laws that make it difficult for us to live out our faith, legal action through the courts. And finally, just on this question, I want to say we've been given democratic rights in this country as citizens to participate in the lawmaking processes, and we need to use those to influence the laws and policies so that we can remain free to live and share our faith. And a model of that is, we see Paul, he was a Roman citizen, and there are at least 4 occasions where he used his rights as a Roman citizen to effectively keep the doors for the gospel open and the opportunity to share the gospel. And in the same way, we've been given democratic rights to participate in the lawmaking process, and we need to use those to keep the doors for the gospel open in South Africa. So I hope that answers your question.
It definitely does. And I appreciate you highlighting just the avenues that exist that we should be utilizing as the church, because the landscape you described was scary and daunting.
It can be a minefield.
Yes. And it sounds like increasingly followers of Jesus Christ will have to practice denying themselves and taking up their cross, as we see in Matthew.
Yeah, and Jesus warned us of that, didn't he? He said, the servant isn't greater than the master. So if they persecuted him, we should expect the same. But that also doesn't mean we should just roll over. We've been given these rights to participate, and we should use the opportunity to influence our policies and our laws for good, so that we can remain free to share the gospel widely with as many as can hear.
Yeah. So Nadine, then what are some pitfalls that religious organizations can avoid in how they frame their founding documents? Because that's a big component of just really establishing exactly what the beliefs are in an organization. So when they frame their constitution, what they put in their membership forms, application forms, codes of conduct, what are some things that they can look out for?
Michelle, I'm so glad you're asking that question, because so often, I work with churches, and particularly some of the smaller churches, and they well-meaning, but they simply have no clue in terms of, the legal things that need to be in place. Now, in South Africa, it's not so currently that if you want to start a church that you have to register it with government and get their permission to start a church. But there are nonetheless some legal requirements that need to be in place, and that you can get challenged on, and that are particularly important if you want to register your church as an NPO or as a public benefit organization with SARS, so that you can get donations and, just from an accountability point of view. So the departure point is exactly what you said. Legally, it's very important for a church, for a Christian ministry, to have some kind of founding document in place. And it would depend really on how your church or ministry is structured as a legal entity, what that founding document would be. So if you are a non-profit company, then you would need a memorandum of incorporation. If it's a trust, then it's a trust deed. Or very simply, for most churches, they are just voluntary associations. That's the easiest and simplest form of legal entity. But they do need a constitution, which really sets out how this ministry will work. What are some of the ground rules? And you can get templates on the internet, but it's good to ask someone who has legal knowledge, but who also has an understanding of church governance, to assist you with the drafting of such a document. And that document, as I said, will definitely be required if you want to register with the Department of Social Development as a non-profit organization, or if you want to register with SARS as a public benefit organization. Now, the challenge is to meet these requirements of the law, which says you have to have certain things in that founding document in terms of how a church or a religious organization is to be constituted legally, but in the process, not compromise on how we understand Jesus wants us to build his church and to have his church governed, what Jesus' model is for the church, because sometimes we can find that those things are at odds. So for instance, while the law requires, all sorts of committees to be put in place from a transparency, accountability point of view, from a governance point of view, and for good reason, so that there can be responsible and accountable decision making. The problem is, and this is just one example, that some churches don't see committees in the Bible. They don't see the church being structured or governed that way. And the challenge then is to draw a constitution in such a way that it meets the requirements of the law, for an NPC, a trust, or a voluntary association, but that it also actually meets both the spiritual and the practical governance requirements of that particular church or ministry. And again, this is why I would strongly advise get legal assistance, and get assistance from people who have an understanding in terms of church governance, eldership, and so forth, because it can get quite complicated. So that aside, where we often see problems coming in is with the statement of faith. particularly with regard to the more contentious, controversial issues such as marriage, what is marriage, homosexuality, issues of gender identity. So some churches prefer to be quite blatant about their beliefs in the statement of faith, saying, we hold to a traditional understanding of marriage, man and woman, no other kind of relationship. We believe God created people male and female, not something else or both. And some of them are obviously, they want to make it blatant so that people are not under any illusion when they come to the church what they are joining. But some of them have found that in the process of being well-meaning, they've actually painted a target on their backs for activists who then use that very statement of faith against that church or organization. So it's very important to think carefully about the pros and cons. Then another point, it's also very important to think around issues such as who will have the final say regarding the interpretation of the Bible. Because we're finding increasingly that people are reading the same Bible but come to such different interpretations on some of these contentious issues. So who ultimately will have the final say? Is it the eldership, or in a training academy, whose interpretation will ultimately be the valid one that the members will have to submit under? And those things need to be stipulated. Also things such as agreement to church discipline, which is increasingly becoming unpopular and also contentious and perhaps not as evident in churches. Now, all of those things need to be dealt with in a statement of faith, a membership form, or a code of conduct. Membership form is great because it does give you some protection, but only if people in fact knew, the members, what it is that the church believes, what it is that the church or the ministry stands for before they joined. So my question would be, how are you informing potential members with regard to the church's stance on some of these contentious issues? But because they're not going to challenge you on things that everybody just agrees with. They're easy to believe or easy to accept topics, but it is these contentious topics around gender, divorce and remarriage, homosexuality, even female roles in the church. So how are you informing potential members of that before they join? Same with employment contracts and codes of conduct. And then finally, a point that I want to mention is a mediation clause. I believe is very important, because we want to avoid people running to court when there is an opportunity. As the Bible also says, as believers, we should be able to sort out disputes between one another before we run to secular courts. So make very sure to include mediation type clauses in your documents. And then just to say, none of these things are, of course, foolproof. If somebody really wants to make a stand and they really want to challenge you and champion a cause, they can take you to court, even if you've done legally everything 100%. But what we are doing really is we're making it difficult for people, for activists who just drive an agenda to take you on. So it's wisdom to have these things in place.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful advice, Nadine. Some things that stand out to me was get legal assistance when drawing up these founding documents, and also get assistance from individuals who understand church governance.
Absolutely.
And understand your organization. And also that general rule to make sure that membership forms and applications clearly stipulate what members and applicants are agreeing to hold to. That
Exactly.
is very helpful. Yeah. So I'd like us now to zoom in on some particular issues that have been handled by FORSA. You have been instrumental in some of the proposed amendments to the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill, and in particular, the definition of spiritual abuse. So as to make sure that religious freedom and religious speech remain protected. So what does this bill really mean for the church?
Okay. So the Domestic Violence Act is an existing act, and what the bill did was to strengthen the existing act and to extend the current definition of and the protection against domestic violence beyond the situation of just a husband and a wife and children. And it recognizes that domestic can also mean people who are just in close relationship with each other and sharing the same property, but who aren't necessarily married to each other or, children of a husband and a wife. So it recognizes that in that context, that people can be subjected to, where they in close relationship, sharing the same property, they can be subject to all kinds of domestic violence, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, economic abuse, but even spiritual abuse. And the background, Michelle, to this inclusion now of spiritual abuse in the Domestic Violence Act is some of the abuses and malpractices that we've regrettably seen in the religious sector. Think, for instance, where you often hear the stories, and particularly in cults, religious cults, those wouldn't be churches. I mean, they're cults, but they're often seen by the media and just the secular world as churches or made out to be, that you see young girls come and they live with the man of God, the so-called man of God, on his property to serve him, to be mentored by him, but oftentimes they actually just turn out to be sex slaves, or people who are forced by religious leaders to drink petrol or other harmful substances, or made to say or do things against their will. So because they can be in a close relationship, that relationship of pastor and member, and because of, people do often see the pastor put him on the pedestal and he's a man or woman of influence. So there can be that potential for spiritual abuse and intimidation that can easily happen. And so that is the reason why they brought it into this act. But the problem was that the definition that Parliament originally included in the bill, in the draft document, was overbroad. And it even would have made the following illegal: to regulate someone's everyday behavior. So even just parents regulate the everyday behavior of their children. I mean, that's the role of parents. Employers regulate the everyday behavior of their employees. So it would have caught that in the net, which was obviously never the intention. And for that reason, the definition was just overbroad and didn't make sense. So FORSA got involved to argue for a much narrower definition of spiritual abuse that would not prohibit things that are not already prohibited in terms of law, and again to make sure that religious freedom ultimately remains protected. A crime is a crime is a crime, whether it's done by a pastor or a politician or a postman. You can't hide religious activity behind a crime, but there's a host of laws for that. So we need to make very sure that religious freedom ultimately remains protected. And so we proposed a different definition to Parliament, and that is the definition that was ultimately adopted by the National Assembly, the one House of Parliament, and which will now serve before the other House of Parliament. And in terms of that definition, it's narrowed down so that it actually agrees with the Constitution. And it says now, spiritual abuse means advocating hatred against someone because of their religious beliefs that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. So you say what these people believe is wrong, and now therefore go do something against them, commit harm. Or it can also be preventing someone from exercising their constitutional right to freedom of belief, including to actually live out their beliefs. Now, clearly that would be wrong. So that would be spiritual abuse. And then thirdly, spiritual abuse could also be manipulating a person's religious or spiritual convictions in order to justify abusing the person. Now, clearly that's wrong as well. So that would fall into a very narrow definition at the end of the day for spiritual abuse, which is good. It's a good result. Hopefully none of us would fall into any of those categories. So that's not something we should be worried about, that we would be found guilty or found in danger to be guilty of. And by the way, just on this question, Michelle, we are seeing this attempt at regulation of religion in a host of different bills that are coming before Parliament. You'll remember that this regulation of religion was something that came before Parliament. Previously, it was rejected by Parliament because there are already laws in place that cover all these things. But we do, at the moment, see it continuously slipping in through the back door in other legislation that is being proposed before Parliament.
Yeah. So I want to ask you one more question before
Yes.
I take some questions from the chat box. I think the chat box is probably enabled now. So you can start, to the audience, you can start typing in some questions that you have for Nadine in light of what she said. Please just remember to keep it relevant to the topic, South African Church and the law, and make sure that your statement is indeed a question, so that it's clear on what exactly you'd like an answer on. So Nadine, there's another matter that FORSA has been involved with. They've been petitioning against the Civil Union Amendment Bill 2020, and in particular, the fact that it prevents state employed marriage officers and magistrates from objecting to solemnizing the same-sex marriages that might take place on the grounds of conscience or religion and belief. Is this not a reasonable requirement since, it applies only to state employees? That's a question that might come up. What is the problem with this bill? And what are the potential risks for religious organizations regarding the enactment of such a law?
Very good question, Michelle. So I think the starting point, once again, is Section 15 of the Constitution, which says everyone has the right to freedom of religion, conscience, belief, and opinion. In other words, everyone includes everyone, whether you work for the state or whether you work for somebody else or whether you work for yourself. You don't lose that freedom simply because you're employed by the state. I mean, think if that had to be the case, think of the implications for other state employees. For instance, for doctors who don't, for conscience reasons, don't feel comfortable performing abortions, or psychologists who work for the state but do not believe in the transgender narrative that people can choose their own gender separate from their biological sex, and who may be forced by law to perform transgender surgeries. So there can be radical implications for a host of people working for the state if we are to say simply because you work for the state, you in a sense surrender your right to religious freedom. So restriction of fundamental rights should always be the last resort, only if there are no other alternatives available. And in this particular instance, there were alternatives available. So what happened was that in some areas, particularly in some of the rural areas, LGBT people finding it very difficult to find state-employed marriage officers, so not religious marriage officers, pastors, but those who actually work at the Home Affairs offices. They're finding it very difficult to find one who is actually prepared to solemnize their marriage. And we can understand that problem, but it's a practical problem that can be addressed, for instance, by having roving state marriage officers go around to the different areas on a regular basis, much like we have judges and magistrates moving around to get to all the rural areas. That was just one of the solutions that we put forward. But in this whole process, it became clear very quickly that the motivation in this instance, why they wanted to change the act so that state marriage officers can no longer have a conscientious objection, wasn't actually addressing a practical problem as much as it was driving a political agenda, which says you will accept our marriage as legitimate and you will marry us like anyone else. You will endorse our marriage, even if you yourself don't hold to that belief. So yeah, we unfortunately did lose that fight, and the Civil Union Amendment Bill did go through. It was adopted in law. But importantly, as I said, Michelle, it only applies to state-employed marriage officers, not pastors, not religious marriage officers who don't have an automatic right or responsibility in terms of the Marriage Act to actually solemnize marriages that they don't agree with. They need to have a specific license to do same-sex marriages. But even this is being challenged as well. Maybe I can just mention, and I know we're then going to jump over to the questions. Right now, government is actually proposing a national marriage policy for South Africa. And what they want to do is they want to take all the different pieces of legislation dealing with different kinds of marriages in South Africa. So whether husband and wife, whether same-sex, whether religious, whether polygamous, and they want to write one law that applies to everybody. And one of the problems with that is that it may potentially force religious marriage officers to do marriages against their will. And we're not only talking about LGBT marriages, but for instance, a Christian marriage officer could be forced to do a Muslim marriage or a mixed marriage of a Muslim and a Christian. And some of them obviously may not be comfortable with that. And so FORSA is very much engaged in that process to make sure, once again, that the religious freedom of religious marriage officers remain protected so that they can only do or solemnize marriages that actually line up with their or their church's religious convictions and beliefs. So yeah, some very critical challenges ahead.
Yeah, that's just to name a few, I guess. Okay, so I'm ready for some questions. I'll just wait for them to pop up. I see multiple people are typing in the chat. I think we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. We'll try get through as many as we can. So here's the first one. Does government or CIPC have a right to refuse registration of a ministry or a church if they disagree with its statement of faith?
In law, no, not right now. But we are aware of instances, Michelle, where it's very subtle, where you put in an application for an NPO status or whatever, and where, if you're a church who is giving problems because of, you're resisting the lockdown regulations, or there's an issue or whatever, where people have said that they're experiencing difficulty in getting their things through. And again, if Papuda and the hate speech bill go through, well, that's going to make it a whole lot more difficult for churches who maybe hold to orthodox beliefs, because then the challenge might simply be, well, you don't believe, or some of your beliefs are unlawful, and for that reason we can't actually, register you as a NPC or so. We're not there yet.
Yes.
But if we're not vigilant, then those are certainly some of the things that we may see in South Africa, as is already happening in some of the democracies around the world.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Vusi, for your question. I have another one from Sean. So he's asking, with regard to the statement of faith, is it good practice for the church to just broadly state that they believe everything taught by the Bible, believe that it's true, instead of highlighting specific areas? So, you mentioned those blatant statements of faith. Which one is better?
It's so difficult to say. I help a lot of churches, a lot of organizations, independent faith-based schools, and really at the end of the day, I highlight the pros and the cons of both. But I think at the end of the day, it's for them really, because they will bear the consequences, of it one way or the other. Because on the one hand, if you say it blatantly, then that could serve as a discouragement to people who may not be comfortable with your beliefs anyway. So you almost avoid that kind of confrontational situation. But on the other hand, as I say, that may paint a target on your back, and they may take you on for that very reason. On the other hand, if you don't say anything and you just broadly state, we believe everything that the Bible says, nowadays, a lot of people will use that same Bible but come to a very different interpretation, say, but you never told us that this is what you believe. And you yourself as a church or ministry may find yourself in trouble when let's say LGBT people who maybe hold to a different understanding of the Bible on some of these issues have now joined the church, have become members, only now to find out that you actually hold to a different understanding on things of human sexuality and gender identity. And then you're in a situation where now you may have to discipline, or you may have to excommunicate members, and then it could potentially become a legal drama. So it's important. It's quite nuanced. So there are ways in which one could say maybe you hold to a more traditional understanding of the Bible without stipulating, it's male and female. So that would kind of be the via media. But it's really to work it through with a particular church or ministry, point out what the options are, and for them to, in the Lord, in wisdom, really find what they are comfortable with, because there may be consequences either way.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you, Nadine. Yeah. So there's another one from Vili. I just want to get to the question. And Sean just says, thank you to you, Nadine. So yeah, I do agree with you that trying moments are coming for the church in light of state laws and the constitution. The church in my country, that's Vili's country, Willie's country, is Zambia, and they foresaw tough times, and how the country was declared a Christian nation, and of course tolerated other religions. And then they went further to create a cabinet position for religion. So do you think that the church or the nation did a good thing in safeguarding Christian values?
So let me maybe just take it a step back and firstly say that FORSA, even though I myself obviously and all our leaders are Christian and are passionate Christian, as an organization, we are doctrinally and faith neutral. And what I mean by that is that we stand for the principle of religious freedom, so that, because at the end of the day, if the Muslims are free, then the Christians must be free. If the Hindus are free, then the Christians. So we work for a level playing field where everyone has equal freedom, not where one has more freedom than the other. So, and we do this ultimately, as I said, because we ourselves are Christians, keep the doors for the gospel open, but we stand for the principle of religious freedom. So FORSA doesn't work for a Christian nation where, where we declared in South Africa as a Christian country and all our laws are Christian laws. I know there are other movements who work for that, but we believe that the best opportunity actually for Christianity to thrive and flourish is in a nation where there is freedom for everyone to live out their beliefs. For me, when I look at the Bible, I see Jesus never forced Christianity upon anyone. He gave people choice, and he said, if follow me, and people had the choice to do that or not. And he spelled out what would be the consequences if you go one way or the other, blessing or cursing, in a sense. So we certainly see that a country where everybody has the freedom to live out their faith, obviously within the boundaries of the law, that's probably the best opportunity, the ideal. And I think importantly also because ultimately, and yes, there are other Christian nations, but Christianity, as we know, Michelle, cannot be legislated.
Yeah,
relationship true born again Christianity, relationship with Jesus will never come through Christian laws and Christian policies. I'm not negating the good that Christianity has done for society at all. Typically in Christian countries where Christians have freedom, society flourishes, the economy flourishes. So that's definitely a good thing, and we should work to have that influence in policies and laws. But we work for a Christian country or a Christian nation. It's really only in name, because Christianity is in relationship is a matter of the heart. Need to be born again in our hearts. It cannot be imposed externally. So interesting question.
That was a great answer. Thank you, Nadine. I think that might have been our last question. I would like to end in a minute. Is there any question coming through? A quick question? I saw people typing. There's 1 minute.
Morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. And certainly, that's why we were saying that's obviously why there are laws in place, that where religion is overstepping the mark and it does actually go into abuse or malpractice, crime is a crime is a crime. And the mere fact that it's being done by a pastor or a Christian doesn't not make it a crime. So that's why there are laws in place.
And what I've heard you saying is not that the law is a problem, it's just what laws are being enacted, and you basically need to monitor the margins. For sure. I think that's great. I think Louis has asked a question. This will be our last one. It would appear that in the main, the Christian faith and practice is currently being tested and contested in the South African context. Are there other religions that are experiencing the same thing, would you say?
I think that's a very good question. I think it is mainly the Christian faith that is targeted, and we can perhaps discuss the theological reasons or biblical reasons for that. But others are caught in the net as well, because the attack is really on traditional values, and even like the Muslim faith, are very traditional in some of the things that they believe. For instance, on the issue of homosexuality. And a lot of so there are a lot of other things where there is a collaboration, for instance, on the Papua Amendment Bill, which again would have inhibited both our ability to live out our religious beliefs and to share our religious beliefs. That would have been an issue for the Muslim faith as well, for the Hindu faith as well. So certainly, while it may be that Christians are more regularly targeted by activists, and maybe because Christians are sometimes seen as soft targets, it is so that we get more fire, but others are certainly caught in the net as well. Maybe I can just conclude with this example. A case that we are currently involved in involves a Christian private school in Johannesburg. There was a little Zulu boy, a 9-year-old Zulu boy, who arrived at school with a isipandla around his arm. That is the wristband that signifies a connection with the ancestors. And the school said, we're a Christian school. We don't believe in a connection with the ancestors and the dead. So we unfortunately cannot allow you at school while this is on your arm, but we'll send you home with your schoolwork for the isipandla to fall off naturally as it does, and then you can return to school. The parents have now sued the school for 300,000 Rand in the Johannesburg High Court, saying that the school's discriminating on their culture. And this will be a groundbreaking case. And if the court had to find against the school and in favor of the parents, it's not only that school that will be impacted. It will be all faith-based independent schools of whatever faith, because the question ultimately is, does the 99% have to accommodate the 1%? Even if the 1% before they signed up at the private school knew what the school stands for. And now they come afterwards and say, well, I also have rights. So that is going to be incredibly important ruling, an incredibly important court case for actually the religious autonomy of private organizations such as independent schools that could also have ripple effects for every other faith.
Sure. Sheesh. Okay, it's sad to end, but thank you so much, Nadine. We really appreciated having you here. It has been really invaluable to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Invite me again. I'll gladly come.
Thank you. And thank you.